So welcome to the green screen section, which is one of the really interesting parts of this course. We've already used green screens as just a really easy way to grab a certain area, like replacing the outside of a window. The foreground was easy to get around because the background was green. But in this section, we're really interested in making some sort of virtual set where we get to place characters into a different world. And although that basically just involves shooting people on a green background and then replacing it, we want to distinguish between two fundamentally different kinds of green screen, a backdrop and a cyc, and three different kinds of shooting, lock shots, pan-tilt shots, and match-moving shots. This is important because you'll want to use different techniques for each type, and you'll be going back and forth between them all the time. So to get started, one of the main goals in green screen is to get the actor and the green screen as separate as possible. So we can light the green screen in a way that's perfect for the green screen, which we're doing with a couple of Kino flows behind the actor. And then we light her completely separately with different lights. We'll call this kind of green screen a backdrop, which can be a cloth on a frame or a wall painted green. But the main thing is that we're not seeing the entire person, so there's no contact with the green screen. This also means that there's little or no spill. If you don't know spill, when you light a green screen, it basically becomes a green lamp that shines back on the actor, giving her a green tint. But with the green screen far behind her, that's usually not a problem. And because background and foreground are separate, it's very easy to get the perfect lighting for each. Doing a backdrop outdoors is basically the same, except that everything is lit by the sun and the sky, so it's a little harder to control. The really good part is that you get authentic outdoor lighting on the actor, which is always harder to do on a stage. The downside to backdrops is, of course, that you can't see the actor in full figure. To do that, you need a bigger green screen. And you can, of course, roll the cloth down. But this is where you move on to a green screen stage called a cyc for cyclorama. A cyc is built to have rounded corners, so you get a smooth transition from wall to floor. So no matter where we shoot, the background is green and keyable. We can shoot in any direction, and the actor can move around freely. Unless people are standing still like a weatherman, there's really no other way to shoot it than on a cyc. A cyc is much harder to light than a backdrop because it's so big that it's hard to get even. But what's worse, it's impossible to light the actor separate from the green screen, so some of our lighting will have to double for both. Moreover, the entire screen becomes a giant green lamp, so there's massive spill that has to get under control somehow. But all these issues are solvable, and almost everything we're doing over the next 2 volumes is on a cyc. So there are 2 basic kinds of green screen. But there are also 3 distinctly different ways to shoot, which have to do with the type of camera movement. Obviously, if we do any movement at all, we have to be able to duplicate it on the background plate in post. For a lock shot, you usually don't have to do anything, not even tracking markers. You just frame it and shoot it. And if we're putting her into a 3D world, we can just eyeball the 3D camera position until it looks sort of right. And then render and composite. But we should do something more scientific to match the station point. The tighter a shot is, the less precise we have to be about the background. We could have framed this background many different ways, and it really wouldn't have made much of a difference. The moment there's any kind of camera movement, though, we need to help with tracking markers, or the animators won't be able to copy the movement. But there's a big difference between pan-tilt shots and actual moving camera shots. To match a pan-tilt, all we need is a single marker in the background that's visible throughout the shot. And in post, the marker is tracked. Then you drive the background with the tracking data, and that can look very plausible. But it's always better to put in two markers, because then the compositor can also match rotation and scale. When both markers are tracked, the software can get the rotation from the angle between them. And that can actually look pretty convincing as a composite. It's important to remember that this only works if the markers are visible throughout the shot. So this version would fall apart. And finally, if you intend to do any real camera work other than pan-tilt or lock shots, then it has to be a match-moving shot or it won't work. You've probably figured out by now that match moving on a green screen is basically the same as we did on the previous volumes. Except that since there's nothing to track, we have to put something in. Extract the camera move. And then the magic happens because suddenly the character is standing in a virtual world. And we can shoot around as if it's completely real. Seeing a shot come together like this is always an amazing feeling because suddenly the possibilities are endless. So we draw a distinction between locked and pan-tilt shots and then match-move shots because the workflow is completely different. There's no doubt that match-moving is 100 times cooler than locked or pan-tilt shots. But the fact is that in everyday shooting, there are plenty of shots that just don't need match-moving. And then it's much simpler to just do them the old-fashioned way and forget about match-moving. So you'll need to go back and forth between techniques all the time. Back in the days, keying was a chemical and optical process. And it depended on splitting the footage into its color channels, and then adding and subtracting channels in clever ways to extract a matte. All pictures are made of 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. And for the process to work, engineers had to pick a primary color that would only appear in a single channel. So it had to be pure red, green, or blue. Blue was chosen in part because it's the least represented color in Caucasian skin. Of course, many colors make the blue channel light up. But a color is only blue when it's only the blue channel that lights up. So engineers had to mix a paint that would cause the blue channel to light up, and at the same time be almost black in the red and green channels. Nowadays, we can key off of any color as long as it's saturated. So even a purple screen would in theory work because it's just red and blue mixed together. But it's still a worthy endeavor to try to nail a single color channel, because it makes it easy to tell if the color is pure and exposed correctly. And most good keyers are also optimized for green or blue. So in the old days, people used blue. But the problem with blue is that on film, it's the bottom emulsion layer. And that makes it the one with the most noise. So that pushed people towards green. Another thing that pushed people towards green was video. Video is a low bandwidth medium. And since you notice green more than red or blue at the same brightness, cameras were designed to give green more bandwidth on a ratio of something like 30%, 50%, and 20%. That made blue the loser in terms of noise, and people switched to green screen. The upside to green is that it has less noise than blue. It also needs less light because it simply appears brighter. On the downside, though, green spill looks terrible. Outdoors, all shadow sides are lit only by the sky and are naturally blue. And blue spill has the same effect. Green spill, on the other hand, would only look natural if people were to be composited into a tropical forest. But keying is now an electronic process, and spill suppression has come a very long way. Here's the plate. Here's a background. And here's the composite without spill suppression. And that really makes it clear how bad the spill problem is. But with the magic of spill suppression, it all disappears, which is really amazing. There's just a price to pay in the quality of the key, and we'll get to that. So for you to make a choice, if you're shooting video, you have to use green. We're shooting with a Panasonic HVX200 camera, so we couldn't afford to lose any light or have any extra noise. For film, you can get away with blue, but the green layer is still marginally better. So choose green unless you expressly need to have something green in the shot, in which case blue would be better. For filmmaking, it doesn't matter. But for green screen, it can be deadly. In a perfect world, you shoot your green screen on 35mm film and scan direct to disk in a telecine at 10 bits per color per pixel, meaning that every pixel gets the royal treatment. And since the scan is a near-perfect copy of the film, you'll have no problems keying it. This is called 444, which means completely uncompressed. But you typically don't get this quality on video. Engineers realized that the eye can't see quick changes in color. So to save on bandwidth, they would cut the color sampling in half, with the color only updating on every second pixel. This was called 422, and visually you can't tell the difference. This picture is 422, and you'd never know it. For the DV format, the engineers went nuts and cut it down to only updating color every 4 pixels, which is called 411. And amazingly, you almost can't tell on a regular shot. But on a green screen, it's deadly, because you end up with 4-pixel staircasing everywhere there's a color transition. Some keyers try to smooth it out, and that can work if you can live with fine detail getting cut as well. But if you look at a key based on an uncompressed version, we've really lost a lot of signal that's never coming back. So many DV or even HD formats are terrible for green screen because the color sampling is too low. Instead, you should use a camera that specifically does 444 at the highest bit depth possible. or of course film scanned direct to disk. We're using an HVX200, which is 422 in its high-def mode. But since this course is standard def, we could do a smart trick. Because as we resize 1920 by 1080 into 720 by 486, all the double pixels become single pixels again, and suddenly it's 444. Not a bad trick if you don't need the resolution. But the problems don't end there, because most cameras also compress the signal into various MPEG or DVC Pro formats. So let's look at the damage from that. All compression is in some way based on a math formula called a discrete cosine transform of all things. And this actually really helps to understand. Basically, an entire frame is first broken up into 8 by 8 pixel cells. And then each cell is converted to a frequency spectrum. You don't need to understand how any of this works, except that low frequencies are in the upper left, and to use a sound analogy, this is where the bass is. And then the frequencies get higher towards the bottom right, so this is where the fine detail shows up. The whole point is that a lot of the high-frequency stuff is visually irrelevant, and you can actually shave a lot of it off, just like you'd use a graphic equalizer to turn down the treble on music. When the spectrum is now converted back into a picture at a lower quality, it basically looks the same, but the file is much smaller. So here's 100% quality against 75% quality, and against 50% quality, and against 25% quality. We're losing more and more detail until we're left with these 8 by 8 boxes with almost no detail inside them. 25% is really butchering it. But 75% was almost like the original. A keyer can live with a little bit of compression, but not too much. Here's a key at 100% quality. And here's a key at 30% quality, which looks very bad. Again, we get these 8 by 8 boxes with no detail inside them. The moral here is that you have to record at the absolute highest data rate you can get. We're recording with the DVC Pro HD codec, which is 100 megabits per second. So some quick math. Our frame size is 960 by 486 before we crop it. So 460,000 pixels. And at 8 bits per pixel per channel, this is 11.1 million bits per frame, or 336 megabits per second. So our compression is about 3.4 to 1, which is actually very close to uncompressed. But only because we're scaling down to SD. Based on the original 1920 by 1080 frame, it would have been 15 to 1, which is a little on the edge. And the sampling would have been 422. Even people shooting film aren't off the hook, because you have to make sure that the signal isn't compressed after the scanner, like putting it back on tape. All telecine should be direct to disk at 10 to 14 bits of color depth if you want the best key. Just know that a 4K scan will use a gigabyte per second, so you only scan the shots that are actually in the movie. A little problem with this course is that it was edited in Avid using a DV codec, because we started production before the HD revolution took off. So the course is 411 at standard def encoded in MPEG for the DVD, meaning that the signal is half destroyed by the time it reaches your screen. If you want to try your hand at keying our shots in full quality, you can download many of them on the website. Is when the backing is completely separate and you're not shooting full figure. Actually, we're faking these chapters on a psych stage, but we have black cloth everywhere, so the end result is the same. We'll first talk about some overall goals, and then we'll go in depth about how to light and expose the green screen. Size-wise, you obviously want the backdrop to be big enough that you have room for your action. But the bigger it is, the more lights you need, and the harder it is to get even. Nothing is easier than if the backdrop is small enough to be lit by a couple of softbanks from each side. So from that perspective, the smaller the better. There's sort of a myth that the screen has to be as far back as possible to eliminate spill, but it's not really true. Because if you move the screen way back, you also just have to make it bigger and use more light, and the net result is exactly the same. Actually, it's just harder to light, and the floor is showing. But spill is not really a problem on a backdrop because the green screen is always behind the actor. The other reason people want the green screen to be far back is to avoid shadows from the actor lighting. But shadows are caused by hard light, not by distance. So even with the screen far back, the shadows are still hard. Soft lights, on the other hand, don't produce shadows at any distance, unless you're very close. So use soft lights on your actors as much as possible. Or at least don't use hard lights in this direction, which isn't very pretty anyway. The only thing that should guide the distance to the backing is that you want to light the green screen from behind the actor, because that's how you get separate lighting. Ideally, turning the actor lighting on and off shouldn't influence the green screen at all. And turning the green screen on and off shouldn't affect the actor at all. For lighting the backing itself, you always want to use soft, physically large lights, because they naturally have a very even spread. Even these two $90 softbanks do an excellent job. You never want to light the backing with hard lights like a Fresnel. Or worse, a work light, because they have very pronounced hot spots and are extremely uneven. You always want to light a green screen as much as possible from the front, especially if you're using a cloth. Wrinkles in cloth become much more pronounced when they're lit from the side. Soft lighting from the front removes practically all bumps. Also make sure that the cloth is stretched out all the way, because wrinkles dramatically increase the range the keyer has to accept as green. Now, in order to shoot perfect green screen, we first of all need to get the lighting even. And then we need to expose it properly. So here we'll start a discussion that's intended for cinematographers, and everyone else can just watch along. Even lighting is one of the most important things you can do for quality keying. Because if we ask the keyer to replace too large a range, we inadvertently also key out all the subpixels and end up trimming the edge detail. The rule of thumb is that green screen should be exposed within a quarter of a stop, which is not that hard on a small green screen, but nearly impossible on a big one. For those of you who don't know stops, a stop is a unit of exposure, and film can record maybe 10 levels. So this range is divided into 10 sections. And for video, it's only about 7 or 8. A quarter stop means that the darkest and brightest parts of the green screen should fit within this tiny window, which is a challenge even with the right tools. The first tool is a spot meter, and many video cameras have one built in, so we'll use that. The HVX 200 that we're using measures exposure in percent, so let's calculate how much a quarter stop is. On video there's about 8 stops, so 100% divided by 8 is 12.5% per stop, or 3% per quarter stop. That means that as you scan the spot meter over the screen, there should be no more than a 3% difference in values. And that's not a lot. But you can console yourself that when we get to bigger green screens, a quarter stop is just impossible. And we have to be happy with a half stop, or even a whole stop. But on a backdrop, if there's more than 10% range in your numbers, you're being too sloppy. By scanning the spot meter across the green screen, you get a sense of where it's too bright and too dark. But another way to locate problem areas is to use the zebra pattern generator in many cameras. And you can do this even if you're shooting film. A zebra generator highlights overexposed areas with a line pattern. And if we increase the exposure, it'll fire first on the hot areas, and then the dark areas as we turn it up. So how you do it is that you first open the aperture until you get the first smidge of zebra pattern, and then remember the f-stop value. Then you open the aperture until most of the screen is covered in zebra. Read the f-stop again, and the difference is your range. In this case, 0.8 stops, which is a bit much, but okay. You get a feel for what's a good zebra. Ideally, as you're turning up the aperture, you want the zebra to suddenly turn on everywhere, which indicates a small range. If you have to turn and turn your aperture dial to get the whole green screen to go zebra, then your range is too wide. But the very best way to check the quality of your green screen is with Photoshop. With a digital camera, which also has maybe 8 stops of range, you take a picture and load it up in Photoshop on your laptop. We then first desaturate the image so we're looking at overall brightness. And then we can use the RGB values in the info panel as the ultimate spot meter. The range is 0 to 255, so 32 is a stop and 8 is a quarter stop. But more importantly, Photoshop also has a function called Posterize, which can limit the palette to 32 shades, which is 32 quarter stops. And when you increase the contrast, this paints a frighteningly accurate picture of your green screen. We actually have 5 quarter stops, or a little over a stop of range. So we need to work on these 2 hotspots. And we need to fill in these areas down here. This posterize function is so revealing that you have to know when to just let good enough be good enough. In the end, we can pull a decent key with up to a stop of range. So to keep our sanity, it's important to just let a quarter stop be an ideal and not feel bad if we don't reach it every time. The only exception is if we're shooting transparent objects like this shawl or smoke or glass. If the green screen is not literally even, much of the transparency will disappear when we key it. So transparent objects require a literally perfect green screen. One of the really important things to understand is that you can't use a light meter to measure green screen exposure just like that, because light meters don't tell the truth about brightness of colors. In theory, colors are the most saturated at 50% brightness. So going down that road, we should expose our green screen at 50% brightness, which would be the same exposure as a gray card. But in reality, when we expose the green screen at 50% on our built-in spot meter, and then look at the separations, the green channel is only 80% bright, whereas a perfect green screen would be 0, 100, 0. So why is that? Certainly no pane is perfect. But the real reason is that light meters give perceptual weighting to primary colors, just like cameras give more bandwidth to some channels. So a perfect green actually reads as 59%, but a perfect blue might read at 21%. And that even depends on the light meter, because a different meter will give a different reading. So spot meters can't be trusted to measure a green screen. And we should instead focus on the real goal, which is to simply get the green channel as bright as possible without going over. On film, the established way to do that is the white card method. The idea is that if we expose a 90% white card at key, it'll read 90% in each channel for red, green, and blue. At the same time, a green screen exposed perfectly would in theory read 0, 90, 0 because only the green channel is lit up. So if we now take a green primary filter, which only lets the green frequencies through, and from Lee filters that would be primary green, moss green, dark green, or forest green, fold it a couple of times, then hold it in front of the eye and squint. The white card and the green screen should look the same. If they don't, we can simply bring the green screen up or down until they're both equally bright through the filter. And now we know that the green channel in the green screen is the same as the green component of white near maximum. And it works backwards too. If we can't change the green screen and the key is too dark, we can change our key level. In this case, we need it higher, until they again match. Then people usually back the green screen off by one stop to make sure it doesn't clip. The white card method is considered a standard, but we have to be honest that we actually find it unreliable. There are too many variables like the channel separation, the filter quality, frequencies in the light, and the film's response curve. And we've seen results that are plus minus several stops, especially on video. And that brings us to the next point, that there's just nothing that beats doing a real exposure test and finding the right settings for your exact situation. To use video as an example, here we're doing 5% steps. And afterwards we've determined that 55% is the ideal setting, bringing the green channel to 85% with a little to spare. Now we know forever that if our spot meter says 55%, the green screen is perfect. This bypasses every other factor and variable because we're comparing final results. On video, we can read the signal live using a waveform monitor. Old-style waveform monitors aren't that useful. But to quickly cover them, they consist first of all of a vector scope that shows hue and saturation for every pixel. The more green pixels there are, the more we get a blob down here. This shows that the color is right, but it doesn't show the exposure. That is shown on a second display called a waveform plot, which shows the brightness of all scan lines. So most of the pixels show the brightness of the green screen, and the rest are thinly scattered. The problem is that the waveform plot also uses perceptual weighting, where color channels are given different importance. So you can't trust it any more than a light meter. For example, perfect green shows at around 60%, But a blue screen we know to be perfectly exposed shows at only 20%. So because of this perceptual weighting, you really can't rely on a waveform monitor for exposure. The only thing waveform monitors do well is to show how even the screen is. We have about a 10% range here, which is actually not very good. Newer waveform monitors have what's called an RGB parade, which shows individual waveform plots for each color channel. And this is as good as a channel test. You can either use a real-time monitoring solution like Scopebox, or you can just load a 2-second recording into an editor on your laptop. Most editors have an RGB parade. Then you simply expose the green channel to 85% and you're good to go. Finally, on film, you want to pick a stock that has the highest channel separation. But on video, we can increase the channel separation by increasing the saturation, and that suddenly becomes an exposure factor. Using a higher saturation causes green to expose higher and red and blue to expose lower. And it's actually okay to increase the saturation to get a more perfect separation, as long as you don't clip any channels. You're not gaining any new information, but it'll compress better in the codec. On our HVX200, we're not increasing the saturation, but we're using the Cine-like matrix, which has the same effect. But to wrap up backdrop green screen, the main thing that stands out is the fairly limited movement you can do with the actor in the camera. Backdrops really aren't designed for moving around a lot. But simple lock shots are easy to do, including with pan tilt. And even many advanced shots don't need more than a backdrop. Backdrops start to be a problem when you want to do full-figure shooting. Of course, you can roll down the cloth. And some people also like to build a green platform that makes a keyable floor under the actor. But you're always fighting against going over the edge, and ultimately this is so rigid that it's frustrating. To do real actor and camera movement in full figure, we have to move on to something bigger. How you do that? As an example, we'll use Laurel Canyon Stages in Hollywood, who have a great two-wall cyc. There are a few major decisions you have to make when you're renting a stage, starting with the size. Bigger is always harder to light and costs more to paint if you're painting it. But small can get cramped and force you to rethink your camera setups all the time, which can be frustrating. You don't always need a giant stage, but be careful with really small ones. Especially if you want to do low angles, the back wall has to be high enough. And if you're doing action, even just walking, you always underestimate how far people can go in just 3 or 4 footsteps. If you take what you think you need and double it, you're closer to reality. It's worth noting that you can't use the space closest to the back walls, because the actors will catch the cyc lighting. So that will shrink your real estate. Ideally, you also want your actors to be as much as possible out here, where there's less spill from the front and the side. But the amount of spill is the same whether it's a small or a big cyc, because spill just comes from being surrounded by green. The only two things that really change with the size are the lighting and the painting. So if you can get a stage that's both pre-lit and pre-painted, you can save a lot of money and trouble. Laurel Canyon Stages, for example, is always painted digital green and comes with KinoFlows. But what many people don't realize is that many stages are also used for photography, where white is the favorite color, and that means you have to paint it green. And you also have to make it white again afterwards. That makes painting a major production issue, so let's look at the math. A person can paint about 200 square feet or 20 square meters an hour. The Laurel Canyon stage is 65 feet by 30 by 16, or about 3,500 square feet total. So one person can paint it in 18 hours, or two people can paint it in 9 hours. With 3 coats and time to dry, you're spending 2 days on painting. Paint can cover about 200 square feet per gallon, so 3 coats is over 50 gallons of paint. At $80 a gallon, that's about $4,000 in paint. And you might still need to paint it white afterwards, too. Add the cost for payroll, 2 prep days, and overtime, and we're looking at $8,000 to $10,000 for doing it yourself. Of course, a smaller stage is cheaper. We'll talk in the next chapter about how you can use hardware store paint for green screen. But for a professional shoot, it would be a disaster to show up with the wrong paint. So unless you have time to experiment and you know exactly what you're doing, you should use professional paints, which can cost a lot more, but you can't afford a failure. If you're doing it yourself, you also have to coordinate both the painting and lighting crews. And someone also has to put up tracking markers on the morning of the shoot. So for all these reasons, it's important to have at least 2 prep days on the green screen stage. Or if you're renting it pre-painted and pre-lit, 1 day with a skeleton crew. And then very importantly, if you're shooting film, you need the camera on the set the night before the shoot to do an exposure test. But on the shoot day, nobody should be worrying about the green screen. Except to repaint the floor overnight, so you start fresh every day. But it also proves an important point that if you make the right choices, quality green screen has almost nothing to do with money. Except for the camera, which has to be good. Our stage has less than $700 worth of materials, paint, and lighting, which says a lot. A very important disclaimer is that this is not a construction manual. We simply want to show a couple of important principles, but if you're going to build one, please do it with the help of a professional who knows what he's doing. Every situation is different, and just because we didn't get hurt, it doesn't mean that you won't. So here's the space, which is a basement. There are 2 major problems, which is one, we'll have to shoot around the support beams, and the gas pipe over here. And the wall isn't that high, so we can't use tall actors. We can accept those limitations because this is a training program and we don't mind changing the shots to fit. But on a real shoot, that would be frustrating. The goal in building a cyc is to get really round corners. With hard corners, you get a hard transition that'll have to be garbage matted. The round corners need to have at a bare minimum a radius of ½ meter. And a big stage needs a radius of 1 meter. We're not just trying to smooth out the transition. The parabolic effect creates a massive specular highlight in the middle, and making it bigger spreads it out. So the first thing that goes up is some framing for both walls. We're using thin sheets of particle board to put on. And we're putting the first one in the corner where it sits permanently bent. The way to get a sheet to stick is to first suspend it inside placeholder screws, and then put in the real screws to secure it. Then we build out from the corner, and the framework is measured so the sheets will hit every third beam. Since the ceiling is so low, we're rounding the top edge too, in the hope that it'll save a shot one day. In the curvatures, we use these extra pieces of wood to get a more seamless edge. Other people build a curved frame to support them. Either way, you don't want a sudden edge between the boards. In the corner, we then build a smooth round thing with wire mesh, and put paper mache and then plaster on top so it can be sanded smooth. Actually, we put plaster everywhere there's a transition or even just a screw. But when you sand these spots down, you have to wear breathing protection and have plenty of ventilation because this stuff gets everywhere. Then we continue adding curvatures at the bottom. And it's important to be really careful because when these boards are bent, they hold a lot of force that can suddenly snap back. We're gluing the boards to the floor with liquid nails, so we're weighing them down for drying. And from here on out, we forgot to take any more pictures, so here's the screen with a round of paint. And that brings us to the paint discussion. What everybody wants to know is whether they can just use hardware store paint, which is much cheaper, or if they really need to buy the expensive paint from Composite Components or Rosco. These system paints are supposed to have a perfect green or blue. But hardware store paint can be just as good or better if you do it right, starting with getting the right color. One way is to get a reference and have it matched. FilmTools.com has an excellent foam-backed green screen cloth, and if you buy a small piece, you can easily have it matched. This color swatch is basically the exact same color, which is Par 4 green from the Home Depot. The advantage to matching is that you can get other things in the same color. But be careful with some of the stuff on eBay because the colors can be all over the map. But matching doesn't necessarily give us the most perfect green, because the only real test of a color's purity is whether it lights up only a single color channel. So we have to do the same test on some color swatches. And to do this test, it's important that your white balance is right and you're under the same type of lights you're shooting with. We then just sit and switch between the color channels in Photoshop until we find the color that's both the brightest in the green channel and the darkest in the red and blue channels. You simply go to the channels palette and switch between them. We've homed in on a color that's both dark in the red and blue channels and pretty bright in the green channel. So here's the best green screen color of all the swatches. You generally only want to consider the deepest color on a swatch because the others just add white. This is maybe the best way to find a color. But then it's not matched and we can't go get a cloth in the same color. So we'll stick to the Home Depot paint for now. And here's the Psych in their Behr brand Par 4 green. The color is really good. But this picture is showing us one of the problems with hardware store paints, that they're too glossy. And this picture is not completely fair because we didn't let it dry all the way. But hardware store paints are made for wear and tear, so they contain a lot of acrylic, which makes them more shiny. So we're getting white streaks in the corners. And white means no color saturation. So when we key it, the streaks stay, which is no good. So we need to be much more religious about getting dead flat paint. And what we're after is contractor grade flat paint, which you can get at a real paint store. You have to insist that you're getting the most non-glossy paint that exists. And here we've again gotten it matched to the green cloth. The color this time is 2033-10 plus white 18 from Benjamin Moore. The plus white 18 is to match the cloth, but you really shouldn't be adding white. This time we're also using a thinner roller because putting it on too thick can actually trap some moisture that makes it more glossy. Then we paint in 3 thin layers. You really need those extra coats because the color becomes much better by the 3rd coat. After it has dried a bit, the gloss in the corners is looking better than we've had it so far. And you can't get much more non-glossy with paint alone. Although the gloss gets better after a day or two when the paint cures. The only way to get it softer is to scatter the light, which is why some people prefer cloth over paint because it's naturally rough. But we can get the same result by mixing sand into paint. 1 part sand to 3 parts paint. Stir it up. And after we've rolled it on all the corners, they get a slightly rough surface like sandpaper. You want to make sure that you're using purified sand because beach sand has salt in it that etches the paint from the inside. After it is dried, we've nearly eliminated the gloss, and this is our final hardware store green screen, which is a solid green that's hard to complain about. So the question is, what's the advantage to the professional paints, which cost $80 a gallon? Well, they're first of all part of a system, so you can get suits and cloths and wires and stuff in the exact same color. It's a problem if a prop guy thinks green is just green and brings in a prop that might not key. But that's not the difference because we can just give them the paint code over the phone. Here's the entire stage painted with 3 coats of Rosco Digicomp, and it looks the same as before. The separation quality is maybe slightly better, but not $80 a gallon better. Actually, the color channels seem to be almost the same, if not exactly the same. So that's not it either. The real difference is that pro paints are almost twice as reflective as hardware store paint. And you can only see that when you put them next to each other. The reason is that the paint is almost pure pigment with a clear base, which is a very high-tech paint. But what's interesting is that spectrally, hardware store paint and Rosco paint are almost identical. The Rosco paint is just able to reflect twice as much light. In other words, Rosco paint only needs half the light, or half the exposure, or half the ISO, or half the f-stop, and you can shoot with better camera settings. So certainly a backdrop will always be better when painted with Rosco or Composite Components paint, because the more reflected light, the better. But professional paint can be wrong for a psych. The thing is that it's unnaturally bright, much brighter than even the white on the paint can. And on a psych, this high-tech paint completely overpowers the flesh and blood people we're trying to shoot. With the result that people tend to be underexposed, and blacks get crushed way too deeply. By comparison, look at the hair in this shot on normal paint. Suddenly you can see the texture and the color. The color. which you have to fight to get with the so-called pro paints at risk of locally overexposing the green screen. What's happening from a cinematography perspective is that the paint exposes at or even higher than key. But the problem is that since everything is lit by the same lights, we can't bring the green screen down where we want it without bringing down the actors at the same time, and suddenly forcing the key level to be minus 1 or 2 stops. The only way to expose the actor at key and expose the green screen 1 or 2 stops down under the same lights is to use a darker paint. Of course, all this depends on whether your key level is 90% or 100, and it also depends on how bright the paint really is. So that's again exactly why you can only truly rely on an exposure test. We've shot with both paints in this course, and we have to admit that we liked shooting on the hardware store paint much better, because all the light levels are more harmonious. So hardware store paint is not a cheap or an amateur choice. And even if money is no object, we sincerely prefer it on a cyc. For a backdrop, it doesn't matter either way because you have individual control. So finally, to wrap up the paint talk, you want to try to keep the screen clean and not drag dirt all over it. You should always have mats on the side of the screen, and the crew should wear shoes that are easy to remove. So only talent walks with shoes on the green screen. It's a good idea to repaint the floor overnight. But it's not a good idea to repaint during the day because the paint changes color when it dries. Also, don't forget that paint takes a few days to cure and looks much better when you give it time. We obviously have to light the cyc evenly, but some of that lighting has to double as actor lighting. There's therefore a tendency to just do everything very even and safe. And that becomes a creative problem in the composite, because the quality of the light is too different between these shots. Another problem is that we can't light the back walls from the front like on a backdrop, because then we lose half of our real estate and the lights are in the shot. But when we light from above, we get a hot spot at the top. Then the light drops off going downwards, resulting in a dark band over the curve. Then it suddenly picks up again in the curve. And then we transition into the floor, which is lit by different lights altogether. That gives us 4 or 5 different light levels to control. And what's worse, they're always in the same shot because it happens vertically. We're also forced into camera settings that reduce the amount of light hitting the film. We have to have a wide depth of field because blur is a no-no on green screen. We need a fast shutter so there's no motion blur. And polarizers, which are a favorite trick to reduce the glare, reduce the light by 1 or 2 more stops that we can't afford. We'll be solving all these problems one by one, some of them later. But first, one of the most fundamental decisions to make is the color temperature, because it decides what kind of lights we're using. For those of you who don't know color temperature, indoor and outdoor light have 2 different color tints. Indoor or tungsten light tends to be yellowish at around 3200 degrees Kelvin. And outdoor or daylight tends to be bluish at around 5500 degrees Kelvin. When your film is tungsten balanced and you shoot indoors, everything is normal and white appears white. But if you catch a window, it seems blue by comparison. And if your film is daylight balanced and you're shooting in daylight, white is white and everything is normal. but indoor lights in the shot appear orange or yellow. It doesn't matter which color temperature you pick, as long as you stick to it for everything. It's generally a bad idea to mix lights of different color temperatures, except that you can of course use different lights and gel them to match. But you get much more bang for your buck if you pick lights that do it natively. There's a trend towards doing all green screen lighting with fluorescents, which are usually daylight balanced at about 5500 degrees Kelvin. Fluorescents can have excellent color rendering. They're naturally soft, and they run much cooler because they only use a fraction of the power. We ran our entire stage off of a single household outlet, which is pretty incredible. The leader in fluorescence is obviously KinoFlow. KinoFlows are extremely bright. The tubes have just the right frequency spikes. And most importantly, they can be dimmed, which you can't do with hardware store fluorescents. And shouldn't do with tungsten because they change color temperature when you do. KinoFlows also come in super green or super blue versions you can use to beef up paint and get a nearly perfect green. But obviously you can't light the actors with them, so you need good separation. As we said, we're taking the do-it-yourself route and lighting the entire stage with hardware store fluorescents. Partly because we couldn't commit a lighting package for a year. And partly because it really proves what you actually need to light a stage. We can't dim like KinoFlows, but we can move lights around. And we can turn tubes on and off, so we'll figure it out. We want to do a quick tutorial on how to use hardware store fluorescents. But we have to again warn you that this is not a construction manual. Electricity can kill you or start fires. So we have to insist that you hire an electrician to install any of this. And you can show him this video. There are three things you're looking for in hardware store fluorescents. First of all, that the fixtures have electronic ballasts and not magnetic ballasts. Magnetic ballasts oscillate at grid frequencies, and that can cause flicker. But electronic ballasts operate at up to 50,000 Hertz, and don't usually flicker at any frame rate. Still, you have to do a flicker test before you spend a lot of money. And also look out for very slow flicker that takes 5 or 10 seconds for a cycle. The second thing you're looking for is obviously the color temperature. And if it's somewhere between 5000 and 5500 degrees Kelvin, you'll be fine. You can also get bulbs in the same color temperature. Bulbs are usually not strong enough to do much by themselves. But in 6 or 8 banks it adds up. And they also have reflectors to keep the light big and soft. These kinds of soft banks are less than $100 on the internet. When you buy fluorescents, get some good ones like these Philips Natural Sunshine tubes. Because cheap tubes have unusual frequency spikes that can make your green look different to the camera. Every tube has what's called a color rendering index for how accurately it reproduces color. And you have to get a CRI over 90. One of the really good things about fluorescents is that they're naturally soft because they have a large surface. We always want the base lighting to be soft because it doesn't look good with a lot of shadows around the actor. This here is nearly ideal. We only have a very soft contact shadow, which we actually want because it gives better ground contact in the composite. Later we'll talk about how to shoot actual shadows and extract them. Right now, let's talk about some overall strategies for lighting a green screen and which order you do it in. The absolute hardest part is the back wall, which can be a real pain to get even, so that's where we'll need to start. The main problem, of course, is that we have to light from above. But natural light drop-off means that the light will always be brighter at the top. To solve this, a special light called a cyc light is often used, which has an asymmetrical reflector that results in proportionately more light being thrown towards the bottom of the screen. But cyc lights are usually tungsten, so they have to be gelled into daylight, and they run very hot. To do the same using fluorescence, you first of all need the lights as far out in the room as you can get without taking over the real estate. Half the height out gives a pretty decent spread. Our stage is very small and the lights are close to the wall, so we need some help to aim the light better. You can do that with a device that's your best friend on a green screen, which is a louver or an egg crate. Louvers make the light more directional. You can only see the tubes when you look right into them, so all the light rays are almost parallel. Louvers eat half the light, but you almost have to have them to control light on a cyc. With louvers on fluorescence, you then point the lights toward the bottom of the cyc, throwing more light down where it's needed more. Some lights come with a louver option, but you can also buy them at a commercial or industrial lighting company. You want them to be black, not reflective. But even with all that, we're still always fighting this dark band before the curve. And there's really only one way to deal with it, which is to beef it up with targeted lights. On our do-it-yourself green screen, we have professional fluorescent bulbs and Home Depot fixtures, and cardboard barn doors. The lights stay cool, but we have to expressly tell you not to do this because a different light than ours could catch fire. This would also have been better done with small Fresnels and daylight filters because a Fresnel can focus the light better. To quickly see the difference, here's without the fillers, and here's with them. So they really do work. This is as accurate as we want to get, because the key lighting will also hit the wall and change everything. Next, it would seem logical to do the floor. But since the actor lighting will change the floor lighting, we actually have to light the actor first. In our case, we have the luxury of not shooting a real movie. So we decided to hang these two homemade fluorescent banks on the right side. And then all our shots will have key light from the right. In reality, you can't lock your lighting down like that. And you need to have some portable key lights to haul around. If the actor moves a lot, it's best to have a bunch of key lights on the key side so the light is consistent. Actually, it's even better to have key lights from both sides because then you can switch from right to left. The goal here is just the basic overall direction. You still need portable keys to control it better. Key lighting takes care of a lot of the floor lighting too. So our next task is then to quickly patch up any exposure problems with extra lights. Like this one, to bring up the exposure in the corner. You have to do this kind of patchy lighting because every time you move a key light, everything changes. And then we can finish up the actor lighting by working on the fill and the rim or whatever looks good. But the workflow is always to first make the walls work, then to do the key lights, both general and specific, then see what's missing exposure and fix it, and finally make the lighting pretty. This procedure is assuming that we're trying to do a feature-type composite, where the actor has to fit into a scene that already has opinionated lighting. The absolute worst thing you can do in that situation is flat boring lighting because it'll never composite. If you're doing a commercial or a music video, you might actually want totally flat lighting. And then it's better to just do a really even green screen and see if that doesn't also work for the actor. A quick way to just get even light on everything is to bounce light off of a big white ceiling. This gives you soft base lighting everywhere. But there's a price to pay in terms of attitude in the lighting. Finally, remember that you only have to worry about the background that'll be immediately behind the actor. Nothing over to this side matters for this particular shot. First of all, you obviously want to avoid any green colors in your subject. It's true that any green that's fully contained within the actor can be garbage matted. The problem is that if we know that something is going to make a hole, and she turns on her side, that hole becomes a broken edge that we have to reconstruct. And we can never do as good a job as a keyer can. So holes are only okay if you're certain they'll never be seen from the side. And we can't ever be really sure of that. The second thing that causes holes are spill. When you pull a key, not all of the matte becomes solid. And this is because some parts of the actor are halfway green from the spill. That forces you to crunch the matte, which basically means that you move the white point until the body becomes completely solid. And you move the black point until the background becomes completely transparent. The problem is that it tortures the key at the same time. So obviously, it's important to have as little spill as possible, and we have a chapter on that later. The third thing that causes holes is reflections, and reflections are everywhere. First is obviously a mirror. If the reflection is inside something solid, it can be patched up with a garbage mat. If it's out here, it's much harder because we have to keep the garbage mat inside the edge of the mirror. But the difficulty really depends on how much the reflective object moves. Because a static object is fairly easy to garbage mat, even if it has massive reflections. If you look at the mat for this car, it's certainly an awful mat that needs almost a complete overhaul. But since it's a locked shot, we only have to paint a single mat. So this is actually an easy shot. Even pan tilt would be okay too. But this shot would be a garbage matting nightmare, because the reflections go right to the edge, and the garbage mat would have to be spot on. So you have to make some choices about visible reflections. One is to eliminate them with a dulling spray, which is basically just dark hairspray. And it scatters reflections just enough that they get a brushed metal look. We're going totally overboard here, but it makes reflections safe to shoot, even on an edge. Just be aware that dulling spray can ruin clothes. But even if we were to keep the original reflections and mat around them, they wouldn't reflect anything useful. Basically either the green screen or the soundstage. We'll talk later about how you can track in actual reflections of the virtual environment. But this is very high-tech and not something you just do. So most likely you'll have to cast some actual reflections directly on the set. On the car, for example, we could do interactive lighting, which can work well in a night scene where the lights come out of darkness. This is a toy car, so we're simply moving a light around. You'd then have to scale it up to real size. But for a day scene, this would be very difficult because you'd have to find a way to reflect a real environment. That's why some people still like to do back projection. And this is obviously just a toy car in front of a computer monitor. But you'd have to find a way to surround the car with reflections, because right now we're only getting reflections in a couple of places. So this would be much cheaper to just shoot for real. When reflections are smaller, you might choose to ignore them, even if they're physically incorrect. These glasses have enough of a green highlight here that in the composite it becomes a hole that shows the scenery behind it. But if it's small, chances are nobody will ever know. However, more sustained reflections can't be brushed off that easily. These glasses would look like a keying problem even to the untrained eye, because they would come and go depending on their angle. Finally, there's an even more subtle kind of reflection that can also be a problem, which is sheen or glossiness. Sheen doesn't look like much from the front, but when it's turned on its side, it starts reflecting the green screen. What's happening is that from the front, the reflections are too weak to matter. But on its side, they get concentrated into a small space, and suddenly it's green enough to break the edge. This concentration always happens on the edge, which is exactly where we don't need it. And materials with sheen all risk disappearing around the edges. You can tolerate a little bit of sheen, but there's a threshold somewhere you don't want to go over. Later we're using a plastic coat, and even with Ultimatte it was a struggle to keep the mat solid. Other keyers that we won't name couldn't even pull a basic key. Since you don't know how your keyer will respond, it's important to see all sheen and gloss as a risk and test it first. Stretches a keyer to its limits, and it's very demanding on the quality of the cinematography. So it's important to understand exactly how it works. First, if we have a big netted cloth, it might look semi-transparent to the eye. But in reality, we're just keying yet another object that's either there or not, which is what keyers like best. But with this finely knit shawl, it's suddenly much more difficult because it's neither green or blue. It's sort of permanently halfway in between. So how do we key that? Well, the thing is that keyers aren't just on-off, because this is what that would look like. It's green out here, and when we meet a certain threshold, we suddenly flip over and become solid. This obviously looks terrible. So keyers have a transition area, like a range between completely transparent and completely solid. When a keyer does transparency, it basically treats the shawl as if it's permanently halfway between transparent and solid. But we're riding a threshold, and if the green screen is not completely even, it can fall apart. So let's go through some examples to see what's easy and what's hard. A typical transparent object is glasses, and clear glasses key just fine. So do graded glasses. Even graded glasses with a yellow tint. You can go pretty far, but less tint is always better. The more difficult part is actually again the reflections. Obviously, the reflections from the key banks are not a problem because the keyer just goes around them. But it's important to always remember that the glasses will reflect the soundstage, not the virtual environment. And this kind of reflection out in the desert doesn't make a lot of sense. The glass itself also reflects the green screen, especially when it's tilted downwards. The green reflections add to the transparency the glasses already have, making them suddenly more see-through. But chances are that nobody will notice. Another kind of transparency is when the green backing is entirely behind something else, like behind a car. Or if we're shooting through a window. What's important to realize here is that being behind a window is not much different than shooting a standalone green screen apart from the reflections. Your absolute #1 goal should always be to get as clean a view as possible, and only have the reflections you actually want. Then we get a clean key, and the reflections give a sense that the window is still there. It doesn't matter per se that the window is tinted. Here we're shooting through both the front and rear window to get to the green screen. And especially the rear window is very dark, but that's just like having NDs on top. And all it takes is more light. We can easily key through the reflections. But obviously you'd have to move the lights around to simulate some sort of movement. This is a clean setup and very easy to do. But you're wise to only do it with the lock camera because the mat needs a lot of paint work. It's very important to respect the idea of getting a clean shot of the green screen and only have the reflections you actually want. This window is perfect because it's see-through except for scattered reflections. But this shot has far too much reflection. Like a permanent layer of white, so thick the keyer doesn't have a chance. That's why we did the other version in the relative dark. So a couple of things you can do is first of all use a polarizer, which can filter out reflected light. You should also consider physically removing as many layers as possible, like rolling down the rear windows, which don't contribute anything useful anyway. Here we could have chosen to have the green screen inside the car. Although the windshield is so intense, it probably wouldn't have saved the shot. Finally, you might consider shooting it without the window at all and doing the reflection as an overlay in post. This works best for close shots where you can't see the outside of the car, because all the other reflections stand still. Now, there's an unfortunate byproduct to all transparency keying, which is a phenomenon we'll call blobbiness. That very soft edges tend to shrink just a little bit in the composite. We'll cut back and forth a few times. If we, for example, zoom in on this part, you can see that the outer fringes of the smoke shrink ever so slightly in the composite. It takes a little time to notice. It's not a disaster, but it is something to be aware of. Blobbiness happens for two reasons. The first is that the keyer has to make some sort of decision about what's transparent and what's solid. And when the difference between the smoke and the green screen is smaller than the difference between two parts of the green screen, that's not so easy. The end result is that what would have been a linear transition from nothingness into solid becomes a harder kind of curve that needs a minimum amount of light to trigger. And then it also becomes solid too soon. That's how the edge appears to shrink just a little. The second reason for blobbiness is that in the green screen plate, the smoke transitions from white into green. But in the composite, it has to transition into whatever's the new background. And especially on bright backgrounds, you see the smoke transitioning into a darker color and then suddenly changing over. Of course, these things can be worked on, but in a raw key, that's what happens. Soft edges look less blobby over a darker background. Obviously, smoke is a special situation, but ordinary things cause blobbiness too. For example, motion blur. Because if you look at it, it's a super soft edge that washes out into nothing. And when you key it, there's again some edge threshold, which is even more pronounced over a bright background. And again, it looks better over a dark background. It can definitely be worked on, but at the cost of overall softer edges. The best thing is to not even go there. And for motion blur, that means shooting with the fastest shutter you can afford. Motion blur can easily be faked in post by software that can analyze the motion. Shallow depth of field is the same problem. The keyer again has to eat a small part of the softness. And anything that's on its way out of focus can become a little bit blobby in the composite. So you should also shoot with the smallest aperture you can afford. You have to anyway, because shallow depth of field is also a problem for tracking markers. This is actually a major reason why it's often better to shoot green screen in a digital format instead of 35mm film. Digital formats have smaller chips and more depth of field. In regular filmmaking, that's artistically frustrating because everything is too sharp. But on green screen, it's a major advantage. If it's very important for you to have shallow depth of field on a green screen, it's better to shoot each layer separately. And then blur them individually in post. But you can only do this in lock shots or motion control. But for a very subtle camera move, you could probably get away with shooting a lock plate for each character. And then putting them on polygons like we did for crowd replication. So with everything we've learned about keying so far, we want to present a nightmare scenario that actually happened on a major national commercial. They brought in rain machines on a green screen. So they first of all shot water, which is both transparent and reflective, so a lot of it will disappear. The water also fell on the green screen, making it reflective and useless. Rain naturally has motion blur because it falls fast, so it would get blobby. And the rain nearest the camera, which is the only rain you can see, was out of focus. So these people made almost every mistake they could possibly make. But this kind of stuff happens every day. In the next chapter, we'll move on to spill handling. But before that, we want to share a secret to keying that most people don't realize that can change your view on keying. The thing is that most keying problems can be solved in isolation. It's, for example, totally doable to come up with a setting that will make a shawl look just right. It's a different setting that'll remove the rim around her arms. A different setting that will make the hair perfect, and yet another setting that'll make the contact shadow perfect. But that setting gives the shawl a white rim. However, there's no magical setting that will do everything in one go. But when you give up the idea that you have to key it in one go, anything is possible. Because then you set up multiple keyers for each part and garbage map between them. And that allows you to pull absolutely spectacular keys, because each part is keyed exactly right for that part. You can even tolerate major exposure problems because you just key each part separately. And this is actually so powerful that we have to tell you to still do a good job on the set. Finally, there's a way to compensate for really bad green screen, which is built into Ultimatte and can be faked with other keyers. It's called screen correction, and what it means is that if you have a shot with an uneven screen, and you have the absolute same shot blank, Ultimatte can use the empty plate to compensate for all the unevenness. Here's the composite without screen correction, which is not very good. And this is with screen correction, which is spectacular considering how bad the green screen was. Notice especially how this seam in the wall disappears in the corrected version. So anytime you're in a lock shot, make it a habit to roll 5 seconds of empty background without touching the camera or the lighting. And still make it into a meaningful composite. So the question is not whether you can get rid of spill, the question is what the price is. And the first price is loss of color definition. All colors are made of combinations of red, green, and blue. So when you mix red and green, you get yellow. When you mix red and blue, you get magenta. And when you mix green and blue, you get cyan. And finally, when you mix all of them, you get white. Now, if we're on a green screen, the spill is green. And when the keyer suppresses green, the mixed colors lose some of their green component. with the result that yellow becomes orange and cyan becomes light blue. Here we have a yellow shirt, first in regular daylight, then on a green screen with lots of spill, and when we key it, it turns orange. So things at the warm end of the spectrum are pushed towards red. But you can probably live with it unless the script calls specifically for a yellow dress. And by the same token, this cyan shirt becomes light blue in the key. But 5 minutes later, you've forgotten the original color, so it usually doesn't matter. On a blue screen, it's the blue channel that gets suppressed, causing magenta to become more red and cyan to become more green, because both colors lose part of their blue component. Now, keyers have algorithms to kind of color correct the color correction and bring the colors back. But the more you use them, the more tortured the image becomes. On the heavy spill shot, the shadows start to get some sort of chroma banding that can look like bad makeup. The second consequence of spill is harder edges. Remember that spill causes holes in the matte, just like transparency would. And in order to keep the matte solid, the keyer has to tighten everything up, at the same time making the fine edges more solid. It especially shows around hair. Here's with default keyer settings, and the hair is perfect. But the matte has holes. However, as we tell the keyer to tighten those parts, we also inadvertently tighten the hair. We're exaggerating here, but it does happen. So we want to remove as much spill as we can on the set without stopping the production for it. One of the really bad ways is to use minus green or magenta gels on certain lights to try to opposite out the green. The theory is that if something is too green, you can cancel it with its opposite color, which is magenta. But in reality, this is what happens. The green light is completely diffuse and comes from everywhere. But the magenta comes from just a single direction and hits the actor in a completely different way. The result is that we cancel green on some parts, but we also suddenly add magenta to other parts that weren't as green to begin with. In other words, we've created a nightmare for the compositor, who now has to try to get both green and magenta out of the shot. Therefore, you never ever want to do minus green or magenta. It's one of the worst pieces of advice out there. The only way to get rid of spill on the set is to physically block it out, which you can do by first of all turning off lights you don't need, and then hanging up pieces of black fabric you can buy at a fabric store for cheap. We've installed our green screen with clamps, so it's easy to put it up and take it down, but some stages just have a curtain. And we cover the floor too. Since we only need green immediately behind the actor, we're free to block out most of the set. And the results are remarkable. Here's first without the cloth. And there's massive spill, which we're leaving uncorrected to show the difference. And here's with the cloth, which is like night and day. Everything's the same in the two shots besides the cloth. But the keyer has to do almost no work on number 2, and it'll come out a lot better in the composite. The metal buttons on her coat don't even reflect green. Ideally, you want to block everything but the actor and her background. But if you're in a hurry, make it a priority to first block off in front of and around the actor, and then move outwards. And if the actor is not full figure, have her stand on cloth as well. But the more you do, the better your shot will get. All these things essentially turn the cyc back into a backdrop, which helps us reach another important goal of being able to control our lighting ratios. Now we can again make these shots with many stops difference between key and fill that could never be done on a cyc. Finally, it's interesting to notice that some colors of clothes respond differently to spill. White is able to reflect green perfectly, so white is the color that'll get contaminated first. Of course, it's also the color that's easiest to bring back because it has no hue. But colors that have no green component aren't able to reflect spill and come out clean almost no matter how intense the spill is. This red shirt, for example, almost doesn't exist in the green channel and therefore is physically unable to reflect green. The same goes for all black clothes. They simply can't reflect it.